All right, folks, welcome back. Today we're talking about marriage and cohabitation. We're really beginning by introducing the marriage chapter of the Marriage and Family course and by going into demographics after we talk about some of the introductory aspects concerning marriage within the discipline, subdiscipline of marriage and family sociology. First, we need to begin with some of the key aspects and features of marriage today in the United States. Keep in mind that we certainly can look at marriage through a number of different statuses. First of which is the legal status or the legal status aspects of marriage. And so, legally, marriage confers tangible benefits and protections to those who are married. Beyond that, marriage also has a symbolic status. It represents something, it means something. Marriage, going on, provides emotional value to the partners as well as reinforcement of that value from interactions with society. So, within the marital relationship, you've got the emotional bond that the marital status symbolizes, and again, that is circumscribed by the treatment that people receive, the married couple or couples receive when they interact with others beyond the marriage itself, their home, and so forth. Also, marriage is an arena of stability and conflict, not only within individual marriages, but certainly too, they are exemplary. They're examples of stability and conflict within society. So, interactions concerning marriage at their core help to form and secure social bonds through ceremonies, celebrations, through the consumption process. So we talked about the market before, about what it entails to interact with society on some kind of economic exchange basis. Also, traditions. So the interactions concerning marriage also involve what we do in a sense that might be seen as a ritual that enlivens or continues past practices. However, the benefits and protections of marriage are also in and of themselves scarce. They're scarce resources where unique groupings in society and aggregates in society, they struggle to gain a greater share of them. And there's also within that struggle differences of opinion insofar as who should be married, who should be allowed and permitted to marry, and under what condition and what circumstance, and also how secular or how, in a sense, outside the realm of religion, ultimately marriage should be. Those are also issues of strife and tension within society, as well as things that people may find conflicting, so to speak, in terms of the status of marriage. In addition, there are some themes that we also need to look at too concerning marriage as well. There are with marriage multiple pathways to getting married, including cohabitation, and we'll talk a lot about that in the second section of this particular chapter. In addition to cohabitation, there's same or opposite sex partner routes as well as remarriage. And so there can also be, of course, combinations, if you will, of those routes. So there isn't simply a single path or a singular route of these three major ones that has to be chosen per se for any one or multiple sets of individuals and groups. One big theme also, of course, within our course and certainly within this subdiscipline is inequality. So we've talked about that in prior chapters and prior lectures. Marriages are stratified. So we talked about what stratification is or what strata are. Strata refers to layers, the layering of something. And so marriages and families are examples of the layers, the unique layers that happen in society, the levels that happen in society. And so marriages are stratified. They're layered and they're paired up and they're separated by social class and increasingly by education. Those who are college educated are more likely to be married today than those without a four-year degree. Keep in mind that what sort of makes this occur is that those who have four-year degrees or more, they are seen as more attractive. They are more sought after for marriage, and they have more choices in the so-called marriage market. So that's one of the reasons why they are able to, if you will, more likely to avail themselves of marriage. And so again, it's a way for middle class and wealthier populations in society also to sort of consolidate their privileges and their benefits, to protect them as much as they can and to help them grow. And within that marital exchange, they develop a sort of bulwark or a hedge against negative or challenging circumstances that can happen throughout life. And again, that often are examples of what can go on in a diverse, large society such as the United States. Now, so those, of course, who have the education, who have the social class status of middle class and beyond, they are, within marriage, their privilege or privileges are reinforced. However, consequently, those who lack the four-year degree or those who have not attained a solidly middle class status or beyond, they are subordinated by this same sort of setup. So they are essentially locked into lower status positions in society, and we're largely talking about members of the working class and the poor. So really what happens here for the working class and the poor is that economic insecurity undermines the prospects of marriage for poor and working class people. Also, in terms of inequality, there are legal challenges, particularly to LGBT rights and the potential protections to gay and lesbian marriages. They are also challenged as well. So these challenges to LGBT rights and to marriage rights reinforces, I should say, the privilege that is held by cisgender straight couples and highlights discrimination directed at gay and lesbian couples. And so we've had gay marriage in our country for 5 years now. At the same time, again, we see within that stability, we see many instances of conflict with respect to, if you will, efforts to rein in or perhaps reject ultimately the possibility of gay marriage and a furthering of gay rights by many groups in society. Also, one big theme to keep in mind too is social change. And again, that's kind of tied to our textbook and how it is organized. And so within marriage, we can also see that it's an arena indeed of significant social change. With social change, we're talking about collective efforts that are aimed at fulfilling or fulfillment of potential. So that's something that we've seen rise consistently over the past several decades. So there are numerous social efforts, if you will, aimed at helping people become and ultimately have and be their very best, particularly in terms of education and occupation. And so as we're stressing, improving and striving to become better people, to become more accomplished, particularly in terms of learning and in terms of what we do in our careers, those efforts do strain the institution of marriage, particularly as we recognize legally and protect legally people as individuals and having sovereignty as individuals, not simply in a connected kind of space to something relational concerning marriage and family. So in addition, there's more economic independence gained through these personal fulfillment efforts. And so folks going to college, going to graduate school, going to professional school, and so forth, those kinds of things, in addition to marriage being put off later in the pursuit of higher education, also once people fulfill that higher education promise, so to speak, they are able to, in a sense, not have to have a marriage for economic reasons. And so they are able to be fulfilled economically beyond the confines of a marriage. And so they don't have that true immediate need to be married upon expressing and experiencing their economic independence in particular. All right, going on, we have also some demographic trends to talk about. So with demographics, we're talking about processes that happen within the population in terms of different kinds of aggregates, in terms of age, in terms of sex, in terms of race, religion, geography, urban, rural, those kinds of things. So ways that we can sort of describe an entire population of people. All right, so here are some examples of demographic trends that are related very strongly to marriage in our society. One is there are falling marriage rates, and we've talked about this as well in earlier sections of the course. So married folks as a percentage of the overall population, they've fallen significantly. The rate, if you will, of marriage has fallen significantly since the 1960s, making the chances of getting married harder than in the past, although most people do eventually marry. At the same time, not with the ease or the ease of transition that we've seen in prior generations and cohorts. Most folks today marry at older ages, particularly if we're talking about age at first marriage. We're looking at the late 20s if we're looking at straight marriage, and small yet significant numbers of people never marry. Again, most people do marry, but again, the number of folks who have not and will not, I should say, has ratcheted up significantly since the 1960s. If we're looking at unique populations, marriage rates have fallen most dramatically for African Americans, who are more vulnerable culturally, economically, and socially than members of other groups. Also within the African American community, there's a greater priority placed on collective action through civil rights and community engagement than members of other racial groups. And so efforts to be assistive and to have an integral role within the community and within one's family, those kinds of things are more important with respect to African Americans as opposed to other groups, and also for African Americans as opposed to marriage. Also, in terms of demographics, we have to look at education a bit more. Again, marriage, as we had mentioned before, it's concentrated amongst those with a bachelor's degree or higher, who have middle, upper middle class, or wealthy status. All right. So with that in mind, cohabitation, although it's practiced by all demographic groups, it's concentrated more among those with less than a 4-year degree, who tend to be working class and poor. And so we'll talk more about that once we get to the second section of this chapter. Also, we have to keep in mind time in terms of the timing. That's also related to demographics as well. Owing to the pursuit of education and careers in early adulthood, married life now is a smaller part of adulthood than it was a century ago. There's also a lot less stigma attached to getting divorced and separated, so people don't care or they're not up in arms as much when they hear about a couple being separated or divorced as in the past. So with less stigma, there's also less sort of consistent marital status year to year in a person's life. So what can happen is those who are formerly married, who were married prior, they may remain single for much longer than they were married. And so that also goes into the fact that we are living longer, if you will. We have a longer life expectancy than past cohorts, although of course there has been more recent discussion of life expectancy sort of capping out and actually being reduced. There's a good book about this topic called Deaths of Despair by the economists Case and Deaton, that talks more about the capping and the actually reversing of life expectancy, particularly amongst the white working class populations. Great book. So if you're able to read that, I suggest it. Going on, demographics in terms of race. Among women, for instance, Asian American women are the most likely to get married in a given year, followed by white women, Latino women, Native American women, and African American women. And again, going on to talk more about the economic vulnerability among African Americans, a lot of this has to do with the shortage of African American men, particularly in the major cities. And so if we're looking at sex ratios, we have a greater proportion, a greater amount of single black women in large cities like Detroit, Chicago, and so forth. We have a greater amount of single black women in a lot of our largest cities versus single black men. There's also greater difficulty among black men with respect to securing full-time employment that would be gainful enough to support a family. And so a lot of this has to do with what we said earlier about deindustrialization. And so the African American population, particularly men, were much more likely to work in manufacturing positions that were lower skilled. And so when we've seen manufacturing go away with the deindustrialization process, the loss of manufacturing jobs over time, once well-paying jobs are lost, that does tend to challenge a lot of the so-called pillar institutions of our society, including marriage. And so that's, again, conversely, if you think about it this way, if you think about your grandparents, your great-grandparents, with those generations, it was very easy for them to get gainful employment, those men to get gainful employment that would support their families without having to go to extensive levels of education first. And so often in the past, even before getting a high school diploma, men could avail themselves of jobs that were gainful, that would truly allow them to support their families financially. And so once you have gainful employment that is reliable and dependable, and it clearly can support economically a family, then it's very, very easy for people to continue these traditional pursuits of marriage and family. And so a lot of, again, the deindustrialization that we saw affecting African Americans during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, now we're starting to see that affect white folks in the white working class today, as much of what we've seen in terms of manufacturing has been lost to automation, in addition to jobs going overseas or to non or lesser union environments like the South. Kind of a lot, kind of a mouthful, I know, but this is also in the notes. And then as you think about what you've seen in communities in and around Mid and Southeast Michigan, it'll probably become a lot clearer why, as you learn about this, a lot of this stuff starts to click. Going on also about African American families, black families tend to stress more that both spouses have stronger economic potential. And so, again, think about what we said about black marriages and black families being egalitarian. And so with that truly egalitarian investment, with those true embracements of egalitarian norms by black families and African American couples, that does set the bar economically a bit higher for black marriage. So it kind of makes sense, again, when you consider the challenges that many African American men have historically had with respect to maintaining well-paying jobs. Again, we're looking at the loss of manufacturing, but we're also looking at discrimination still being present and ongoing in black lives. And so that combination does allow black couples to think a bit more strategically about marriage once they get married. The idea being, hey, we both need to be on good footing economically, and then that will bode well for the marriage. So those are calculations that you don't have white folks having to make as much, or Asian American folks or Latinx folks having to make as much as with respect to African Americans. Also going on, interracial marriage. As of 2015, almost 20% of our marriages were between spouses of different racial groups. So, however, if you think about it, almost 40% of our society is comprised, if you will, of people of color. So clearly there are still significant barriers to interracial relationships, and roughly 90% of whites marry other whites, a much higher percentage of intra-racial marriage than that for other racial groups. And going on, in terms of religion, we can also, or I should say in terms of demographics, we can also talk about religion in that respect. In general, there's less religious endogamy. There's less marrying within the same religion than prior to the 1960s. And a lot of that is consistent with the legal recognition and protection of people as individuals. And so the growth of individualism is also a part of that. However, more than 90% of Christians are married to other Christians, which is a much greater percentage, a much greater, if you will, number than what you see amongst Muslims or Jews. All right, so we'll have more on the topic of marriage when we shift and talk about marriage, cohabitation, and modern marriage next week.